Hi again and welcome to DeepDive Talent Insights and Analytics channel. This is I Think I Love My Job. If you don't know who I am, or you've been here but can't quite remember, I am Kalifa Oliver, the resident expert here at DeepDive on all things employee experience. What are we going to talk about today? Employee engagement. Let's go. In an earlier episode, I had mentioned that employee engagement is not the same as employee experience. We do know that engagement is a key measure within the employee experience, but they're often used interchangeably, so I thought I'd spend some time discussing engagement and then engagement as it relates to experience. Traditionally, when you hear about employee engagement, you think about things like satisfaction and commitment. And one of the reasons for that is because many surveys and measures of employee engagement, especially the most popular ones, tend to focus on satisfaction and commitment measures and loyalty measures. But at its core, employee engagement is a more internal variable. It's a lot closer to motivation. You go from internally motivated to externally motivated and vice versa. So you're either really passionate about it and the motivation comes from within, or you are doing it because of some external reward or exchange that's happening. Employee experience is a lot closer to the intrinsic side. On a continuum of motivation, there's something that's a lot closer to what we know, which would be identified motivation. Motivation in and of itself to work is not usually likely. When nobody's looking and when our lives and our livelihoods and our way of living doesn't depend on working, generally, we probably wouldn't work if we didn't have to. We'd be more engaged in passion projects. And so passion projects typically are what you would look at when you think of somebody being very internally or intrinsically motivated. I know what you're probably thinking. What about somebody who starts a business that's a passion project? And we often hear, find your passion and you follow it and you do it, you'll never work a day in your life. But lots of studies have shown that when you put money or you place a monetary value and exchange on a passion project, it does become work and it becomes less motivating. Identified motivation is more of when you identify with the tenets and the values of the organization that you're in. And so the motivation to do work is more sustaining. It helps with coping. It helps with dealing with factors around you that may stop you from doing the work. So in this discussion, when we look at engagement, we're looking more at that type of motivation, the reaction that you have to the job, the energy around doing a job, the little internal fire that allows you to keep doing a job and get up and go to work every day. That's what we're talking about when we talk about engagement. I want to be clear that we really should not confuse employee engagement at its core with employee satisfaction or commitment or any of those type of variables. They're cousins, they might even be siblings, but they're not the same thing. If you think about the idea of employee experience, like I've discussed before, it really focuses on what an organization can do to ensure that employees are having the experience that is desirable, that aligns with the values of the company. They are able to do their work in a way that they can be productive and they could perform as highly as possible. That's what the employee experience is measuring. That's the outcome we want. Employee engagement is more of a symptom. You can use it to get a read on what's happening in terms of your employee experience. So think of it this way. When somebody is engaged in their job, they can sustain changes, like transformations, like mergers, like acquisitions, like lack of resources, like constraints, they have more of the coping mechanism, more of the energy needed to commit to the task that they're doing and be really good at it. A key thing that I have found in my own research, and other researchers have found this, is we tend to think that engaged, highly engaged employees mean you will have less turnover. But think about this. When your employee is very engaged in their job, they tend to be more attuned to variables that are happening at the work, at the job. They tend to be more sensitive to constraints that are not allowing them to produce or be productive. They tend to be sensitive to poor leadership. They tend to be able to see issues that others may not see because they are so attuned and aligned and invested in their work and the tasks that they perform on a daily basis. It is highly possible to be highly engaged but not committed to your organization. Let me give you an example. There are many jobs in which people stay because they love what they do. If you ever talk to a nurse or a teacher, a lot of them will tell you they find something special in the work that they do. They love to teach. They love to take care of people. They love that work. But they would do it in another hospital or another school in a heartbeat if the conditions were better for them to do it. Now think about this. If somebody is more attuned to all the positives and negatives that are happening within the organization, and it allows them to cope more, it also means that they can only sustain that coping for so long. Engagement is also related to stress. Somebody can cope with the changes for so long and be creative and be innovative and find ways to deal with things like a lack of resources to do a job. They can do that for so long. And then there's a sharp decline in their engagement because it's exhausting. They're using a lot of resources to help them because they're so engaged in their job. So a lot of times when a transformation is continuing over a very long period, or you find that transitions are not happening properly, or resources aren't being provided over an extended period of time, your more engaged people could sustain it for longer. But when that stress hits, they're done. And you actually lose a lot more of your engaged employees. And you keep the ones who don't really care. They're here for the check. They are here so they won't get fined. A lot of extremely talented people can be highly engaged. Engagement can sustain stress. Yes, we know that. And that's really important in changing times like these, especially where you're dealing with things like a pandemic. Who would have thought we'd deal with a pandemic? The changes and rapid changes in work and work as we know it, and how we view work and how we define work, are something your really engaged employees can really help you with. They could sustain it. But there's a mental exhaustion and burnout that comes from engagement. Think about when you're passionate about anything, right? If you're passionate about painting, but all of a sudden, like you have a block, or you're passionate about writing, you have a block, or the resources to do the work, it's not there. The stress is more. You can cope, you can find ways, you can be creative, but the stress is more because you feel it more. Consider your less engaged people at work. They're here for the ride. You know, you tell them what we're gonna change, they're like, all right, I'll write it out. You don't necessarily lose your less engaged people when the organization isn't providing everything that they can. You often would lose your more engaged people over time. You've got to take care of engagement. Here is why this is important. A lot of companies invest a lot of money in getting engagement scores, and they often run into the problem where they cannot find how these scores relate to outcomes like attrition, turnover, customer service. In theory, we get it, right? If you're more highly engaged in the job that you're doing, these outcomes should follow, but a lot of times we can't find it. And that's because a lot of times when we're actually measuring engagement, we're looking at commitment. You're asking me how much I like the company. You're asking me about a reputation, if I would recommend the company to friends and family. That is a topic for another day. We're gonna have a long talk about that. The difficulty a lot of companies run into when they think about engagement is they're not actually measuring what we would consider engagement. You're asking about factors that don't necessarily get at what you want, and you're conflating concepts, and it's why you can't really get what you're looking at. You know, things like intention to leave is a strong predictor of actual turnover, but intention to leave is not necessarily a key indicator of whether somebody is engaged in a job or not. You could be highly engaged in a job, but you want to leave, right? Because you like the job, but it's becoming very stressful to do the job. Things like that are things you need to consider when you are looking at engagement. Why is engagement an important variable, an important score to continuously look at? When you're highly engaged folks, when their scores start dropping, it's usually an indicator that something is wrong and something is going wrong within your employee experience. Engaged people typically can sustain change and shortages and transformations and resource constraints. They can sustain through it. They can work through it. They can be creative because they are so engaged. But when those scores start to drop and engagement is showing that it is just dropping in your organization, it is a key indicator that something is going wrong with your employee experience. And that is where you have to look at engagement and other variables that measure your employee experience. You start looking at your leadership, you start looking at the reputation, you start looking at managers, you start looking at supervision, you start looking at all these other things in addition to engagement. Engagement is a tool, it is a symptom checker. Engagement is like taking your temperature to see if something is out of the ordinary in your health. Engagement is not your answer to everything. It will be a high correlate, or better put, it is highly related to other things happening in your organization, but it is very difficult to get it to predict things, except maybe turnover might be coming, and even that requires some extra work, and it's not the most reliable indicator of that. So how do you look at engagement? A question I often get is when you do an engagement survey, how much is a big drop? Well, I'm going to give you the psychology answer. It depends. It really depends on the factors. How much of a drop is it? Is it a big drop in your highly engaged folks? Is it a big drop compared to other factors related to your employee experience? Which questions are you finding issues with? Are people just suddenly like, I'm not energized by this job anymore. I don't enjoy this job anymore. You know, when you have to look at it as a part of a whole. I've seen a lot of companies make large financial or otherwise people decisions just based on an engagement score. You wouldn't want your doctor to make a life or death decision because your temperature was a little higher. You want them to do a full workup. You want to make sure that they're understanding all the other things that's going on with you, so when they start doing diagnosis and recommending actions that you need to take, that they are looking at the whole person. When you look at engagement is a tool, it's your friend, and with anything else related to people data, it needs to be contextualized. Engagement is a data point. Engagement is an indicator. Engagement is a symptom. The key thing that I do want to make very clear is that when you put your engagement surveys within a continuous listening program, you have a much richer data set. When you look at engagement, you need to remember that engagement is not necessarily a key indicator of your turnover. It's not necessarily the cause of customer service issues. It's not necessarily that. It could be. It has relatedness to it. And the more data you have, the richer data you have, including engagement data, the better story you can tell, the better decisions you can make. So I just wanted to spend that time talking about engagement a little bit. We can talk about engagement all day. But I did want to put it within the context of the experience. I do think it's important to measure engagement. I do think that we need to reevaluate engagement and how we look at it and make sure it's not a catch-all for everything you want to know. If you want to know about satisfaction, ask about it. That's okay. If you want to know about commitment and loyalty, ask about it. That's okay. You don't have to name it engagement in order to get rich data from it. The more tools that you have in your tool belt, the more information you have, the richer your continuous listening program is. So don't only depend on one tool. And that said, let me also add that engagement should not be used as an indicator of performance, because based on everything I told you today, because somebody is not performing, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to. It could very well mean that they don't have the tools that they need to get the job. They don't have the information they need, and that is on the organization, and that is part of the experience you provide. So don't make it a punitive thing when it comes to engagement. It just needs to be a tool in your tool belt, and it can be a very strong tool, but it needs to just be a tool. I know some people have really strong feelings about engagement. If you do, go ahead and leave me a message in the comments. I will be happy to read them and discuss. And don't forget, if you like what you see and hear on this channel, please go ahead and subscribe. I am really happy for all of the enthusiasm and the support. Thank you again for joining us for this episode of I Think I Love My Job. And let me leave you with this. There is always room to have a brilliant experience. Bye.